This is Duke University.
I want to start with a quote from the final paragraph of Belief in Resistance. There, Professor Herrnstein-Smith summarises her argument about the microdynamics of incommensurability. She says as follows: Incommensurability is neither a logically scandalous relation between theories, nor an ontologically immutable relation between isolated systems of thought, nor a morally unhappy relation between sets of people. Rather, it is a contingent experiential relation between historically and institutionally situated conceptual discursive practices. Quote. What she means, I think, is that incommensurability between different knowledge kinds doesn't represent a failure. It is, in fact, business as usual. As she notes in a later chapter in Scandalous Knowledges, here I'm quoting, play of differing and indeed conflicting perspectives is a necessary condition for the emergence of new ideas, practices, in any field. Today, I would like to talk about the importance of incommensurability for interdisciplinary encounter. I'd like to make a case that incommensurability be held more dear to our interdisciplinary projects, that we think more explicitly about what incommensurability offers to us. My specific case study is the recently emerged synthesis between the neurosciences and psychoanalysis. This so-called neuropsychoanalysis draws on classical psychoanalytic theory, infant development theory, attachment research, and data from the cognitive and affective sciences. The goals of this literature are often clinical, or at least most of the material I've been reading recently is clinical. So it's interested in improved treatment outcomes. So its goals are usually clinical, but there is also interest in the popular sciences, and more recently in places like philosophy, so I'm thinking of Catriona and Rutherford's recent work. The epistemological ambitions for many people working in neuropsychoanalysis is to repair the rift between psychology and neurology that Freud made as he forged psychoanalysis in the dying days of the 19th century. For these writers, the new synthetic science enacts a world where the logic of the two cultures has been resolved. And there seems to be, as the arguments have been run, there seems to be benefits on both sides. So in this new post-two cultures world, the neurosciences get a theory of psychic dynamism that puts meat on the bones of their theory, and psychoanalysis gets verifiable data, expanded theories of mind, and improved cognitive. In short, the neurosciences hold out for psychoanalysis the mesmerising possibility of renewed respectability. Neuropsychoanalysis is an interesting case study. I'm going to argue precisely because of its failures. And as I talk about its failures, I just want to bear in mind that I'm very attached to both neuroscience and psychoanalysis as projects, and very attached to the idea that they can talk to one another. But something has gone wrong, right? The synthesis has been enacted. So neuropsychoanalysis is an interesting case study because most often it fails to challenge the authoritarianism and conventionalisms of the two cultures' culture. It is for this reason that Barbara's work on the relation between scientific and humanities-based knowledges remains indispensable to thinking about new epistemological monocultures like neuropsychoanalysis. In the first instance, her work helps us to not be too credulous when it comes to scientific data themselves. Feminist work is at its strongest when it is able to work with rather than against scientifically generated theories and data. And while feminist theory has been enthusiastically and sometimes productively anti-scientific, it seems to me that we are better served by having closer engagement with the sciences, with the very least by not having an anti-scientific stance as our first port. Having said this, and I have talked about this a lot elsewhere, having said this, I am now increasingly concerned that there is a tendency to simply flip these politics around, to flip the anti-scientificism around. To flip these politics around and to work with scientific data in a very literal kind of way. There is a growing credulousness in the humanities about the data put in front of us by scientific information. I found this to be particularly evident in what I'm going to call the neurohumanities literatures, which take up claims about human neurological function as certainties. They take it up with the credulity that they are unlikely to grant their own disciplinary objects, texts, images, or social structures. This is a credulity that was never encouraged by the early feminist commentators on the sciences, people like Anne Foster Sterling, Evelyn Fox Culler, and Haraway, and it is a stance that Barbara's work elegantly circumvents. For it's very hard to be credulous about scientific truths when they are defined as follows. And here I'm quoting from Scandalous Knowledges, where Barbara defines scientific truths as, and I quote, the more or less stable products of an especially tight mutual shaping of perceptual, conceptual and behavioural practices in conjunction with material technological problems or projects that have an especially wide cultural, economic, or political importance. Reading Barbara's work that stretches back to the long days of the science wars, I'm left wondering if we have still not yet given up our belief the sciences are foundational, true, and irrefutable. And rather than angrily resisting this law, we are now simply capitulating to it. And of course, neither furious resistance nor docile capitulation really gets to what it is about scientific theories and data that can be so energising to feminist, queer, and deconstructive politics. So, what I want to give you is just a little bit of a sense of what has gone wrong, in my view, with neuropsychoanalysis. And in particular, I want to show how Barbara's suspicions about the dangers of consilience, which she talks about in Scandalous Knowledges, how these suspicions are playing out in the field at this moment, and to canvass what I think might be some of these responses to this drive for consilience. What I'd like to propose is that perhaps certain kinds of primitive responses that Barbara has rightly asked us to avoid, that these kinds of primitive responses may nonetheless be some of our best weapons against the drive for civilised consilience. So let me just say a little bit about this literature and what's going on. There's been this blossom interest in bringing neuroscience and psychoanalysis together, and it's produced a lot of texts since, say, the late 1990s. Some of these are primarily clinical, some are populist, and some are principally academic. My key question about this emerging field is this: what kinds of interdisciplinarity is being practiced by these new neuroscience psychoanalysis literatures? Which is to say, what methodological difficulties lie in the path of an alliance between neuroscience and psychoanalysis. It seems to me that what's going on is there's too much concern with producing a strong, polished alloy out of the various elements of neuroscience and psychoanalysis. And these literatures have tended to overlook the lines of fissure, the inconsistencies, flaws, and fractures that such alchemy must inevitably generate. So I'm interested in whether there are other kinds of bonds which could be formed between the neurosciences and psychoanalysis. For example, could strong bonds be built on the incommensurability of these two fields? So could the strength of the alliance be precisely the way in which they are incommensurate or thwart each other? So I want to argue that the interdisciplinarity of these new neuropsychoanalytic projects ought to have the effect not of bolstering the authority of neurosciences or psychoanalysis, but of each being somewhat undone in the presence of the other. To this end, I'm searching for a mode of neuropsychoanalytic mutuality that is strong because it is capable of tolerating, perhaps even enjoying and promoting the process of being undone. To put this all another way, the key interdisciplinary issue for the neuropsychoanalytic synthesis may not be content. Most literature is concerned about whether this kind of prefrontal cortical processing is what's activated in transference or is activated in certain attachment disorders and so on and so forth. So most literature is concerned about taking some kind of neuroscientific account and some psychoanalytic account, seeing how well they fit together. So I'm less interested in this question of content, how different things fit together, and I'm much more interested in the question of methodology. Do the neurosciences and psychoanalysis ought they have, could they formulate the same kinds of epistemological practices? Specifically, could there be a productive alliance between the anti-foundationalism psychoanalysis, especially as it has been practiced in the critical humanities since the 1960s, on the one hand, and on the other, the empirical ambitions of contemporary Or, to put it more interestingly, could there be a rewarding disarticulation of these two epistemological projects? This kind of disarticulation, this kind of working with their thought, has already been practiced, interestingly, elsewhere. Just to give you a small example, it's Janet Halley's 2006 book, Split Decisions, How and Why to Take a Break from Feminism. This is primarily concerned with political and conceptual disjunction. Who gets to be unbuttoned by whom? This book and the debates around it, and actually a lot of the initial debates were held here at Duke. This book and debates are part of an ongoing, theoretically sophisticated debate about whether or not feminism can accommodate the study of sexuality. Halley makes a strong case that theorists of sexuality occasionally need to take a break from feminist tenets in order to secure a cogent conceptual sphere for the study of sexuality. There are continuing discussions in response to Halley and others about what constitutes the proper object of feminist and theory, and to what extent these spheres overlap, contradict, co-evolve, amplify, and suffocate each other. These discussions show that the interdisciplinarity of feminist and queer work is an ongoing encounter, rather than a dilemma that can be readily or conclusively resolved. What many feminist or queer theorists will tell you is that we are not much interested in happy heterogeneities. Happy heterogeneities is a quote from Scandinav's novels. Actually this week I was teaching Darwin, and we were talking about the famous bit in the origin about the entangled band. And Darwin's understanding of the world is entangled in precisely this way. And you know, the Darwin's understanding of the natural world is not a monoculture. You know, there's a sense in which these things are always thought and interesting. So it's been an important historical touchstone for many of the new neuropsychological projects that Freud, of course, initially trained as a neurologist, and you hardly pick up at somebody making this point at the beginning. His turn from psychology to neurology around 1895 is often figured in the neuropsychoanalytic literature as Freud's abandonment of early, serious neuroscientific notions. And just historically, it's not clear that Freud was so desperately attached to neuroscience and neuroscience. Nonetheless, this is how it's represented. And something about this trope of abandonment of science suggests that the reconciliation of neuroscience and psychoanalysis a century later is perhaps inevitable and not a little romantic, as if neuroscience and psychoanalysis had found each other after an extended estrangement. This also implies, of course, going with the romance thing, a core compatibility between the neurosciences and psychoanalysis, as if their separation has been fated rather than necessary or fruitful. And so this feeds the fantasy that their reunion would be harmonious, collaborative, and reasonable. As an example of this, I give you, this is a longish quote from the inaugural editorial of a journal that started in 1999 called Neuropsychoanalysis. And this is what the editors say of the project they see in 1999. The goal of this new journal is to create an ongoing dialogue with the aim of reconciling psychoanalytic and neuroscientific perspectives on. This goal is based on the assumption that these two historically divided disciplines are ultimately pursuing the same task. Notwithstanding the fact that neuroscience and psychoanalysis have approached this important scientific task from radically different perspectives, the underlying unity of purpose has become increasingly evident in recent years. If our two disciplines are truly engaged in the same fundamental task, then it should be possible to somehow reconcile their views with one another. This journal will publish unsolicited original articles on any topic can facilitate consilience between psychoanalysis and neuroscience. As Barbara would remind us, the drive to consilience, which is now, seems to me, kind of axiomatic, quietly axiomatic to most of these neuropsychoanalytic projects, with perhaps the exception of the biology of freedom, which seems to be doing something kind of interesting. It seems like a lot of French neuroscience psychoanalysis work is maybe situated something different. But the rest of it seems to be consilient, axiomatic. As Barbara would remind us, this drive to consilience makes the incompatibilities between neuroscientific data and psychoanalytic theory temporary impediments that a more developed neuropsychoanalytic science will overcome. It is a daydream of scientific progress that hopes to turn interdisciplinary differences into transdisciplinary goals. E.O. Wilson has been very clear about what is entailed in such ambitions, and I'm quoting from the book Resilience. He says, there is intrinsically only one class of explanation. It traverses the scales of time, space, and complexity to unite disparate facts and disciplines by consilience, the perception of seamless web of cause and effect. So the editorial aspirations of the journal for consilience assume that the long-standing divisions between neuroscience and psychoanalysis have been more infelicitous than fortuitous, and that these divisions have misrepresented what is, underneath it all, the same task. So there's not a lot of thought about how Freud might have felt to take a break from psychology and what taking a break meant in 1895 and the consequences of that. Later on, it just seems to something he did that just simply as it was unproductive that emerged out of the break. In the end, I suspect that this view that neuroscience and psychoanalysis have been engaged in the same fundamental task is simply the twin of the older, more orthodox conviction that they have been involved in utterly different tasks. The methodological economy of how knowledge is fit together, how they destabilise, skew and transform each other, seems weirdly unchanged, whether one's positions are for consilience or estrangement. So when practiced carefully, an alliance between neuroscience and psychoanalysis should understand the damage done to psychoanalysis by its having been sequestered from the natural sciences. It should understand the damage done to the neurosciences by their detachment from psychodynamism. And it should understand the inefficacies of consilience as a solution to interdisciplinary differences. And I suspect that there are ways of thinking about the mutuality of neuroscience and psychoanalysis that are less integrative. Mutualities are unruly, aggressive, destabilising, litigious, strange. So what I want to do is kind of keep the question of the thought alive as we think about how these two things are. So let me offer some preliminary thoughts here at the end about such mutualities by returning to part of Barbara's argument of scandalous knowledges. In the chapter on the tribal warfares between the two cultures, Barbara comments that the cognitive style of many of the two culture discussions appears to be driven by impulses that are, I'm quoting, extremely primitive, what she later calls crude caricatures. In particular, the antipathy of science wars divides the world, into us and them, splitting this climate of thought. Hard-working scientists on one hand, complacent humanists on the other. Sophisticated critics on one hand, block-headed physicists on the other. Good object, bad object. Splitting lends itself readily to certain kinds of paranoias and pomposities that have a certain initial intensity and glamour that in the end kill innovative thinking. I concur with Barbara that splitting is extraordinarily destructive and very hard to work with within oneself. But at the same time, I'm wondering if there might be some other archaic impulses that are going to help serve us well in relation not so much to the wars, but to the people who take themselves to be post the two culture science wars. So I'm wondering at this point we need to cover that is, some of our best anti-capitalism responses might be to amplify impulses that disorder the reasonableness projects that integrate disparate domains. And this is because I feel that one of the most troublesome aspects of consilience is the veneer of respectability that covers over sustained methodological projects. To give you an example, so I can talk about this for quite some time, just very quickly. There's a lot of interest in the neuropsychoanalytic literature in what they call cognitive unconscious. And there's this interest in the cognitive unconscious at the expense of the theory of the dynamic unconscious. And this is nothing, it seems to me, if not victory of civility, prudence. The cognitive unconscious is just, briefly, is what Freud would call pre-conscious. So it's non-conscious, non-repressed material. And there's an enormous amount of clinical, a lot of the clinical neuropsychoanalytic stuff deals not with dynamic unconscious, but with cognitive unconscious. And it's very minimal to empirical inquiry, so a lot of the empirical work is on cognitive unconscious. And there seems to be a big victory of civility. The cognitive unconscious threatens no one's sense that in the end everything will line up, match up, make sense. The neuropsychoanalysis so happily misunderestimates the unconscious, speaks to a near universal interest in averting our eyes from its terrorising, infantile, sexualised and aggressive, averting our eyes from what's inside us all, athwart us all. It allows us to turn to possibilities that make us who we are. So, sometimes meetings between the two divergent traditions and ideas do happen, and they can be intense, conflictual, and abrasive, Barbara reminds us, and it is because of this they are mutually transformative. The neuropsychoanalytic synthesis ought to not simply be about how to integrate psychoanalytic theory with neuroscientific data. It also ought to be about how each moves athwart the other. So, for example, might psychoanalysis make the neurosciences a little dizzy? And here I'm interested in Samuel Ferenczi, who is precisely interested in this task of how can you throw certain kinds of biological theories off their axis to make them dizzy. So dizzy returns her at the end to the very last sentence of this final paragraph, belief and resistance. Barbara says, thus it may be that at the end, on the real judgment day, which the philosophers are always us, when all the stories are told, and all the chips are in, counted and compared, we will be unable not only to say finally one, but even to tell which was which. Right, it's the last sentence. Not being able to tell which was which, not being able to tell which will be which, seems like an important interdisciplinary goal, and it's one I think that requires a strong commitment to incommensurability. When we are no longer sure who's on what side, who ought to be on what side, when we start to see the sides themselves are always already folded each inside the other, then under the sway of Barbara Smith, which is very galvanising to disciplinary truth. Thank you.
There's seats up in front if people at the back would like to come forward. We have an empty front row, practically.
Barbara.
And then seats in the middle, too. Well, it's an honor and a pleasure to be part of this conference around the work of Barbara Herrnstein Smith. Barbara's important presence in my intellectual world since the 1970s. Someone who, as you know, is always ready with enthusiastic recommendations for reading important readings outside the realm of literary studies, value theory, science studies, etc. Always extremely stimulating. And beyond that, of course, she has also been, as Fred Jameson mentioned, practically the only scholar courageous enough to articulate and defend a version of relativism that seems to me entirely sensible and indeed unavoidable. That even in an era when the term seems to frighten everybody else. But I want to look at her early engagement with science in poetic closure, a study of how poems end, and how do I make this screen come up? Real good. Where did it go? Technology stuff is not all that it's not all that it's cracked up to do. It's always true.
I'm going to be able to get it out.
Okay, well, we had some of you who were here when we were testing this may have seen this wonderful picture of Barbara in 1968. And the cover, on the back cover of Susan, you want to pass the book, hold the book up and pass it around? So I thought we had it working, but anyway, there's Barbara in 1968. That's the back cover. The technology is not my paper. I was going to project some poems in case people wanted to talk about them in discussion, but I just cite them. So I want to look at her engagement with science in that early book, Poetic Closure, a study of how poems end, published in 1968. That book still is, it seems to me, unsurpassed as a study of the structure of the lyric. The concern with how poems end, of course, means the concern with how effects of closure are produced, and that involves thinking about what are the common structures deployed in lyric in general. In this case actually lyric, English lyric, Renaissance to modernism, 20th century, beyond modernism and beyond. So it's a concern with how radically different elements of poems, including formal features such as different rhyme, to the broad repetition of all sorts, to the broadest thematic concepts, affect readers and interact, especially to affect our reading. This book is really the best sort of reader response criticism, produced before reader response criticism had been theorized or vulgarized. It undertakes, and it's especially admirable in that it it really is doing poetics. It studies the structures and functioning of literature without setting out to produce new interpretation of poems. Many works that focus on poetic structures end up, in the end, taking on the task of interpretation. So I would contrast this, for example, with Cleanthe Brooks's The Well-Wrought Urn of 1947, which is a much more famous book. It offers hypotheses that belong to a general poetics. That the language of poetry is the language of paradox. That lyrics are frequently a dramatic structure based on irony, etc. But the Well-Wrought Urn is much famous, I think, partly because it's a study of essays on canonical poems. And each essay ends up offering, not only illustrating new critical premises about language and conceptions of irony, etc., but offering interpretations of canonical poems, which people in the profession have seen as the task of literary criticism. Should come up with new interpretations of poems. Barbara is exemplary in that she knows that that's not what's supposed to be done in poetics and in poetic closure, and she's interested in accounting for the fact that this ending seems satisfactory, whereas this other ending has seemed unsatisfactory. So how do we explain that? Brooks doesn't have nearly as much to say about the actual structures of these alleged well-wrought urns as a poetic closure. It's unfortunate that it has been the more famous work through the years. Her book, Barbara Herrnstein's book, is also different from Brooks, wholly different from Brooks's in its openness to empirical scientific study of perception and behavior. I stress openness because Barbara does not take on any model as authoritative. She uses B.F. Skinner's concepts and terms, she writes, for purposes that would perplex or dismay their author. She remarks that our terms are likely they're naive and obsolete. Psychology, presumably physiology of perception, are better understood. But her presumption is that the experimental study of behavior and perception is highly relevant to the study of literary effects and literary style. She's interested in how we experience poetic elements, how that depends upon prior experience of forms, and especially with our familiarity with worldly uses of language, and how the temporal process works. I'm interested in this, not, I would say, more dramatic fashion of Stanley Fish, for whom the reader's consistent surprise at what happens comes to be the meaning of the poem. But Barbara is interested in what gives a sense of closure, what makes an ending seem successful or unsuccessful, and of course doesn't hesitate to take note of elementary facts which are usually ignored, such as that a factor in creating closure is our ability to see that this poem is coming to an end in a few lines. See a poem. Well, Gestalt psychology offers a model for thinking about poetic closure, since psychologists have been especially concerned with describing the dynamics of the perception of structure. There are various laws it is posited. The law of Pregnance, which states that psychological organization will always be as good as prevailing conditions allow. The laws of organization, whereby similarity and proximity of elements maximize our tendency to respond to them as unified. And the law of good continuation, whereby a shape or pattern will continue in the same and be continued in its initial mode of operation. It's interrupted or something. So these don't seem recondite principles, but they are cited, and they play an important role in her exploration of what she calls the process of reading, where she writes structural principles, both formal and thematic, are gradually deployed and perceived. And as these principles make themselves known, we are engaged in a steady process of readjustment and retrospective act. But I think actually the main effect of Gestalt psychology, this book, is to provide a distance from claims of literary critics about the structure of particular forms, and especially claims about the role of formal features in producing structure and closure. Those claims whose authority often comes from the critic's conviction of his or her own intelligence and good taste, of many sort of experimental process, or even a commutation test, which is a mild form of experimental work. The passage through Gestalt psychology, that is, opens a requirement of demonstration. Does structure X really produce closure, or just continue on in the same fashion? Barbara carries out some nice experiments with nonsense verbs, looking at how meter works, what happens if we introduce rhyme here, how does that produce a more effective closure, again, sort of commutation test thing. And she argues convincingly that except for recognized fixed forms, such as the sonnet, framing effects of various formal structures do not suffice to produce effects of closure and need to be supplemented by thematic references, particularly to important stopping points such as sleep, death, night. Moreover, conditions that contribute to the sense of truth, including various forms of verbal repetition, also contribute to the sense of closure. So, especially stimulating and perspective, for final chapter on closure and closure and anti-closure in modern poetry, where she looks at the structural or thematic ways in which modern poets combine the two in order to bring poems to a close without giving an impression of excessive neatness. So Carlos Williams dictum that a poem should not click like a box is a stipulation for different forms of closure. So poetic closure I take to be the best account of poetic structure we have. It's still, unfortunately, still the best account of poetic structure we have. But her account has one fundamental premise that I find extraordinarily perverse. And I'm inclined to say about her what she once wrote about me in an essay of mine about an essay of mine on narrative theory many years ago. She wrote the deviations from his premises. She wrote, permit Culler to make some strikingly original, fruitful contributions to literary theory in spite of his unpromising convictions. More pointedly, that's not sharp enough for Barbara. More pointedly, she writes, like the basically honest but happily inept character in a caper movie, he almost always manages to pull the job off anyway, or at least have something valuable to show for his act. You remember that? Anyway, so I've waited 30 years or so. Though I don't want to compare Barbara, it's not the hapless caper that she's comparing it to. But I do think the diversity of the premise is something important. In my case, the alleged problem was my conviction that poetics should look to linguistics for a methodological model in order to break away from hermeneutics. That's one thing about linguistics is not devoted to see new interpretations of English sentences. In her case, the problem is a premise that owes nothing to Gestalt psychology. My conclusion is she ought to have stuck to the Gestalt psychology here. It was a venture into speech act theory that did her in. She posits that a poem is a fictional imitation or representation of an utterance, as a play is an imitation of action. Everything a poet says may be true, she writes, but his saying of it is not. It is as an utterance that the poem is a fiction, the tense. The poetry is a representational art, she emphasizes. Each poem, I quote, represents not merely the words of an utterance, but a total speech act. It's total italicized. The most obvious example of this, obviously, is the dramatic monologue. Indeed, this theory, which is now very widespread and I think dominant in lyric pedagogy, even though Barbara Herrnstein Smith is not usually recognized as its inventor, just as well, urges students to treat every poem as a dramatic, in fact, a dramatic monologue. A fictional speaker whose situation and motivation are then to be reconstructed. So why would someone speak thus, and what are they doing in speaking thus? This conception of lyric, which makes it into a mini novel, the character whose motives have to be analyzed, is pedagogically effective, but doesn't work for large numbers of lyrics, where I'll be happy to say more about that in the discussion. Right? Gestalt psychology posits that we need a frame for understanding, but nothing in Gestalt psychology would suggest this particular frame. So the question is, why does she adopt it? I think there are two reasons. First, she wants to resist attempts, which were rampant at the time, attempts to distinguish poetic language from so-called ordinary language. Since an important part of her argument is that poetic effects are achieved by the ways in which language of poems is tied to uses of discourse in other contexts and for other purposes. But the fact that poetic effects depend upon, as she writes, our experience, an incalculable number of verbal experiences, acts, and scenes, that fact certainly does not entail that the poem is a representation of real-world utterance. And second, I think the second reason is that she wants a simple formal solution to the problem that often bedevils the theory and pedagogy of the lyric, namely the relationship between the I of the poem and the poet. The premise of the Imitation Speech Act is a neat, efficient solution, since it enables her to say simply that this I is by definition fictional, since the poetic utterance is a fictional imitation of personal utterance, rather than to say it's by definition fictional, rather than warning against linking the I with the poet as if this were a matter of tact or of critical strategy or something to be adjudicated on a case-by-case basis. What is surprising, though, to be confirmation of the perverseness of this hypothesis, the dubiousness of her premise, is that despite the care with which she explains this conception of the lyric, it plays almost no role in her accounts of poems that she discusses, for many of which it would be extremely difficult to say what the utterance or possible speech act that are represented. And if the technology were working, I would at this point show you a slide of Emily Dickinson's "The Heart Asks Pleasure First," but I don't need that for my discussion. The heart asks pleasure first, and then released from pain, and then those little anodynes that deaden suffering, and then fall asleep, and then, if it should be the will of its inquisitor, privilege to die. But this is the first example in the book, which is introduced to define terms. Now, what's the real-world speech act being represented here? I would say there is none. We'd have to invent one, to try to imagine a speaker. And to imagine a speaker would be a diversion from appreciating the poem. What we have is a poetic reflection on the propensities of the human heart that then comes with the real kicker at the end, in the tale, where when inquisitor and the privilege to die give us a judgment that is not easy to attribute. You don't know whether to attribute that judgment to the heart or to the poet or to whom, where that judgment is a judgment. It's a judgment with a real sting to it, but it's not located or tied to a particular consciousness, much less a fictional speaker. Her section discussing stanzaic forms concludes with another form, which nothing is to be gained, it seems to me, by trying to perceive it as a representation of a speech act. Okay, well, here her example is Herbert's Virtue. It doesn't matter, Herbert's Virtue. I can't actually recite Sweet Day. Sam, I could probably recite it. So Sweet Day, so
years ago.
Yeah, anyway, but Herbert's Virtue is a series of addresses. First three stanzas are a series of addresses to the day, to the rose, to the all of which must die, and then only a sweet and virtuous soul, like seasoned timber, never gives, but though the whole world turn to coal, then chiefly lives. Now, her discussion of this poem's formal structure, the effects of closure achieved in the third stanza, where you're trying to get all must die, makes no attempt to work out what sort of speech event is being imitated here, or what's the situation of an alleged speaker who addresses the day, the rose, and the spring. Such addressing is a poetic speech act, what I argue, not imitation of some oral speech act. One case where she does take up the question of lyric as imitation speech act is in discussing the temporal structure of lyrics, where temporality, particular to lyric, rises. Here, this is the it's not the present tense of general assertions, such as the heart asks pleasure first. That present tense of lyric is very common, but she's interested in lyrics with a narrative in the present tense, which is really peculiar to lyric. And if one's trying to make an argument about the distinctiveness of poetic language, that's the place to focus. If you have a poem that begins, I stand in the long schoolroom questioning, or I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day, you know you're in a poem. Can't really be anything else. This present tense of lyric narrative is very common in lyric, but seldom addressed by critics. Smith here proposes, this is very valuable poetics, two models for narrative lyrics. The first, a report of a past event. So in the past, essentially related to personal anecdote, usually though with a turn that breaks out of the narrative mode and often brings in a present tense, a framing comment of some sort, though the framing comment can also be in the past. As the speaker notes the significance of this anecdotal event, or offers some thematically implied termination. Is one model. The second model for this special lyric present tense is it issue, this particular issue. That's a model she calls simultaneous composition, which represents, she says, more or less interior speech, representation of interior speech. Her analogy to explain the structure of such lyrics is that of sportscasting, where the announcer of the basketball game reports the events as they in the present tense, as they are going. And now so-and-so goes in for a layup, and achieves closure when the game is over. This is an interesting case for her because the closure does not need to be quite so structural. It's whenever the game is over, then the sportscaster stops. In any case, in Keats, so is Keats's ode to a nightingale, example here, is that a representation of a speech acts like those of a sportscast? Now it's certainly possible, a case where I think it is possible to think of it in this way, speech acts reporting a series of mental events. But actually, I think her description of simultaneous composition takes us in another and perhaps a more productive direction. She writes, the poem is generated in accordance with the passage of time during which it is presumably being composed. But composition by the poet, of course, is supposed to be quite separate from, according to her model, supposed to be quite separate from the representation of the fictional speech acts supposedly being represented. And that's the point of the model. The whole point of claiming that the poem is not special poetic speech, but a representation or mimesis of ordinary speech events. If we instead think of the time of the poem as the time during which it is composed, rather than the time of speech events being recorded, we're dealing indeed with a special poetic speech act that draws upon our knowledge of many other kinds of speech acts, rather than dealing with that, rather than fictional imitation of a real world speech act. But so it's interesting that in one of the few cases where Herrnstein actually addresses an interpretive problem in the book, how to take a particular ending, which has seemed inadequate, she does not make the move that her theoretical framework ought to suggest or require. If it's the case that her account of lyric as a fictional imitation of a total speech act maintains that to understand a poem is to work out the implications of that possible utterance. Who is saying this, in what circumstance, for what reason, purpose, etc., what motivation. That would be how you go about clarifying a poem. What would someone mean if he or she were to say this? But in taking up the question of the ending of Shakespeare's sonnet number 66, tired with all these for restful death I cry, she doesn't ask that question. The poem offers a potent catalog, again, the poem I can't recite, potent catalog of worldly ills, as to behold, desert a beggar born, and needy nothing, trimmed in jollity, and similar things of that sort. And then concludes, tired with all these for restful death. Tired for all these, from these I would be gone, save that to die I leave my love alone. So, citing before Winter's indictment of this ending as despairing sentimentality, she finds a way of defending it, not by asking what someone would mean if he or she were to say this. Neither she nor Winters approaches the problem that way. It would be a very crude approach to it. Both pose a literary context, relating it to other poems. Winters to other Elizabethan poems that are dealing with disillusionment with the world, but which try to come to terms with the problem rather than just adopting Shakespeare's enunciation and pronunciation. But where Barbara constructs an alternative interpretation and defends the ending, not by appealing to what someone might mean if he or she were to say this in the world, but by stressing the context of other sonnets in Shakespeare's collection, sonnets that deal not with disillusionment with the world, but with the redemptive power of love. So in this context, she writes, the line might be experienced, in fact, as fulfilling expectation suppressed to some degree by the body of the sonnet, but nevertheless present. No, I will not die. To do so would be to leave my love alone and vulnerable in this rotten world. So the key context is literary thematic. The literary thematic one of other poems, not a worldly speech act, not a total worldly speech act that might be imitated. That seems to be a very reasonable Gestaltist solution. When frame is the other poetic acts. So indeed, her section on logical sequence, section in the book on logical sequence, concludes that although a lyric may imitate logical discourse, that is not what it is, and the reader's experience of its conclusion will be determined by the fact that he ultimately responds to the poem as something other than a piece of reasoning. I think the point really ought to be a broader one, that we respond to something other than an imitation speech act, for all those elements in the poem that distinguish it from literary discourse. And I think she admits as much in a discussion of Robert Frost's Nothing Gold Can Stay. Nature's first green is gold, is hardest hue to hold. I could do that. I don't have the poem, but very short poem. It ends with, okay, it's only gone from my mind, I'm sorry. The appropriateness of the conclusion, she writes, the appropriateness of the conclusion is nothing gold can stay. Anybody know that off? So dawn goes down today. There's a few more. Nothing gold can stay. There are a couple more lines in there. It's about 6 lines long. So, anyway, the appropriateness of the conclusion is experienced without regard for the speaker's particular motives or circumstances. That's right. I think one could go further and say there's no point in imagining a speaker with motives and circumstances. And for poems like this, Baucom's razor to allow us to cut off the imitation speech act theory. We can analyze the progression by which gold becomes figurative, which is what's crucial in the poem. Nature's first green is gold. It's a hue. At that point, it's a color, and now at the end, it's anything of value. We analyze the process by which gold becomes figurative without imagining a speaker who revises his observations or reaches some kind of twigs, suddenly, aha, comes to a realization. That's sort of unnecessary novelizing. So, a supremely valuable book, I would say, using the words of hers that I quoted earlier, manages with great intelligence and elegance to draw a set of interesting and valuable conclusions from a highly questionable premise. And she went on to abandon Gestalt psychology for speech act theory, which seemed to offer solutions to some theoretical problems, but created a model that for very large numbers of lyrics distracts us from those features, precisely those features that provide structure and closure. She's so effective and conclusively analyzed.
I'm only going to be just showing the text of some passages that I'm going to be talking about. I thought it would be helpful for people to be able to look at it. So I want to thank Barbara for, I guess, inviting me. Source.
Mark,
come
you
here.
speak louder,
Yes,
please.
to come here. Is that better? Yeah. So I want to thank Barbara for inviting me to come here and do this. And I don't want to. I'm not giving a paper. I want to sort of do an informal kind of a thing, as informal as I can manage, where I guess I reflect a little bit on the time that I've been here, which is about 2.5 years, during which time I've interacted with Barbara in lots of ways. And I suppose a little bit before that as well. And I want to sort of mix together some comments on some of her work and some lessons that I think I myself have learned from her work, and some sort of, I guess, a kind of an account of how my own work has developed in the last 2.5 years, in part, I believe, through contact with Barbara, both sort of direct intellectual contact and also perhaps more contextual, robust contextual contact as well. And some of the moments of interchange. So I kind of want to put together a kind of comment on Barbara's work and its significance, and some more personal comments about myself and my own work. And I hope you don't take this as indulgent. I really kind of take it as the best way that I can address the charge, to sort of say something about the meaning and value of Barbara's work for me. So I just want to start, before I do that, with some brief comments about how I know Barbara. I knew her prior to, it wasn't even my arrival at Duke 2.5 years ago, but I guess a couple years before, I'd been invited by her to come and address the, whatever it is, what is it?
Center for the Study of Everything.
Center for the Study of Everything. Okay. It was at the time when I had published this thing on Bill Viola and critical inquiry, and involved neuroscience and temporality that's going on there, and the relation between the micro domain and the macro domain, and all of these things that I continue to think about, although I think in ways that are more productive now, partly for having a chance to interact with Barbara. And you know, before that, I knew her work mainly on sort of the science wars and the notion of science studies and so on, and had seen her give talks, had read some of her work, but I didn't know her personally. So when I then was kind of thinking about coming to Duke, I suppose, and talked to her and saw her and so on, and she was very enthusiastic, of course. Well, not so close. She's not always enthusiastic, but she was enthusiastic in this case. And I really didn't understand. I mean, I sort of really didn't understand why. Like, I was happy and sort of groovy and so on, but like, why is it that, you know, that Barbara likes my work? And I say that in particular because, I mean, I see myself as a kind of, you know, strong theorist type. I'm always trying to make claims. I'm always trying to say I'm right and others are wrong, and I was trained in that tradition and so on. And so in other words, I mean, I see myself as kind of exactly the kind of person that Barbara sort of tries to find, so that, like Socrates, she can take me down, right? And, you know, so I think I now, maybe, this is what I want to get to at the end, have some sense for, I guess, a kind of, you know, a kind of affinity or something that would explain sort of the welcome that I got from Barbara, which of course was appreciated, but it's nice to sort of understand this thing a little bit better. We'll see. Yeah, I guess what I want to reflect on personally really involves having been involved in a workshop on phenomenology between mind and media that I convened together with Rob Mitchell and Barbara over last year, and I guess it was just last year, is that right? Where we had numerous discussions about you know, phenomenology in this moment. I mean, I work very invested in phenomenology and its return today, and believe that it has lots of things to say to us in lots of ways that weren't done justice to by the post-structuralist critique that kept us from going back to this. Many of us of my generation were going back to this until now. And so I guess I'm commenting implicitly or explicitly in what I say today about what I learned from seeing Barbara in action in these sessions, and Barbara's not so much direct commentary on my own kinds of issues involving this nexus of phenomenology, neuroscience, and media, but sort of the ways in which she engaged other people who were talking, the issues, the readings, and so on, in ways that actually helped me to reflect very much on what I'm doing. So I want to say a little something about that too in the end. But the first thing I want to do is enumerate 5 what I admire about Barbara moments. And these are 5 moments of, that are represented by passages from her work. For me, it's the recent work, so from Scandalous Knowledge and Natural Reflections mostly. I don't know her work on poetic endings, although it sounds fascinating. It sounds also, moreover, completely fitting with the later work. Interesting. So 5 moments in her work where I really think I've learned something from her, something very specific from her. So the first of these is, the first of these things that lessons I've learned from Barbara is her fairness and her rigor when commenting on scientists and generally narrow-minded scientists that she in some sense wants to correct, right? And I mean here her ability and her desire to really take seriously, that means to submit to rigorous scholarly interrogation, issues and problems that many of us, and I would include myself first and foremost, I have no time for these kinds of things. You know, in the critical humanities, many of us would be happy to just dismiss these things as unworthy, unimportant, not needing this kind of commentary. And I can give an example. It's an interesting example because it involves Steven Pinker, and Pinker I take to be one of the people that Barbara most thinks in need of correction. But this is the moment where Barbara actually seems to me to have something positive to say, or almost positive to say about Pinker. And it just exemplifies a kind of way of proceeding that I can't do, but I really admire. So it's a quote from Scandalous Knowledge from the Animal Relatives Difficult Relations chapter, and it's fairly long. I will read it. Pinker's catalog of distinctive human achievements, which omits mention of any artistic, philosophical, or aside from technology, other cultural accomplishments, will strike many readers as distinctly lopsided as well as otherwise distasteful. The idea that the highest reaches of primate intelligence are exhibited in feats of ecological expansion and technology, inhabit every ecosystem, reshape the planet, walk on the moon, and so forth, is altogether consistent, however, with a conception of the human mind as a computational mechanism designed to solve environmentally posed problems, and with a conception of art, philosophy, and other cultural activities as, at best, secondary and superficial elements of the conduct and conditions of human life. What is especially notable here is that the definitive conjunction of these 2 ideas in evolutionary psychology yields a view of human beings as absolutely continuous, her emphasis with other animals with respect to social and sexual behavior, and absolutely discontinuous with them, from them with respect to cognition. To judge from the current vogue of evolutionary psychology among members of the educated public and the ever-increasing number of popular publications applying its analyses to an ever-widening range of human practices, from rape and infanticide to landscape painting and romantic poetry, this is a settlement of the question of our kinship with other animals and a characterization of humanity that is like beasts in our social and sexual behavior and like computers, how we think, that currently appeals to a great many people. Okay, and it seems clear to me that doesn't appeal to Barbara, right? But she's not only interested, right? She's interested in the way that in the broad context and the multi-layered context in which scientific, like many towards on, like which science takes hold, but really here interested in how this particular conjunction we find in Pinker's work, computational mind and animal body, really resonates with what people want to believe. And she takes that very seriously in the process of showing why we should agree with Pinker, right? And I find that move to locate the broad context for evaluating a scholarly or scientific claim really, really impressive. So unlike Pinker, Barbara doesn't see the strength of the claim in its narrowly scientific truth. And indeed, she, as we know, has made narrowly scientific truth one of the things that she's most interested in criticizing, right, in many contexts. So she's not interested in the narrow scientific arguments about computation and animality, but rather in terms of she's rather interested in a much larger, possibly undelimitable set of concerns that has to do with why people believe, right, why people believe such an account, and embraces ultimately everything that impacts their lives. Right? So belief as something that concerns much greater context and a much more complex situation than what someone like Pinker is talking about. So in my opinion, with analyses like these, and I don't know whether she intended it this way, but and it's me here, right, saying I find this really meaningful. In analyses like these, which are consistent across Barbara's work, one can think of the non-dismissive engagement with alien abduction stories at the beginning of Natural Reflections as well here. Barbara really raises the bar for the rest of us, encouraging a kind of intellectual honesty as a kind of part of the method of dealing with claims that one disagrees with. Okay, the second thing that I've learned from Barbara, or thing I found meaningful in Barbara's work, is her ability to liberate science from its narrowness and to make it available for a more general engagement. And this is obviously related to this first point, right? And it's also related for me in a kind of personal way to the question and some doubts I've had in my own career over whether I have any business commenting on science, right? And in a certain way, Barbara is one of the people that's helped give me the courage to do that, I suppose I would say. So the first one is a comment on Scott Atron's "In Gods We Trust, the Evolutionary Landscape of Religion" from Natural Reflections, and in particular on how the invocation of positions characteristic of evolutionary psychology closes off much of what is interesting about the so-called new naturalist position, right? This new naturalist position that she's interested in explaining on religion, right? Why religion would be something grounded in our evolution, according to these various theorists that are making use of evolutionary psychology in sometimes more and sometimes less limited ways. So this is her on Atron. The dubious conceptual moves involved in the evolutionary psychological new naturalist generation of mental mechanisms are illustrated in another passage in Atron's "In Gods We Trust." Here, associating our alleged intuitive comprehension of the concept of gods with children's alleged intuitive knowledge of grammar, he writes, Atron writes, "Without such biologically based competencies, the products of millions of years of biological and cognitive evolution, a child's acquisition of such a wide range of cultural knowledge in a few short years would be miraculous. This is also true for any adult's ability to network from a vast repository of detailed information in a mere lifetime, or for any anthropologist's ability to understand something of an alien culture in a season or two of field work. The argument, familiar, this is Barbara now, the argument familiar from Noam Chomsky's theory of language acquisition and repeated by other new naturalists, is that to avoid believing in miracles of human learning, we must believe in a storehouse of prior inner competencies, the existence of which, for many critics of the argument, would be hardly less miraculous. Contrary to Atron's suggestion, explanations of the phenomena at issue are by no means impossible without the assumption of such inner competencies. An unshakable conviction of the existence of such competencies, however, is likely to make alternative explanations more difficult to discover or recognize. Atron's examples here of supposedly otherwise inexplicable human achievements, learning to speak one's native language, mastering the basic informational repository of one's native culture, gaining insight into other cultures, are highly complex and individually quite different types of accomplishment, each the endpoint of an array of processes that occur over time. An adequate explanation of any one of them would seem to require at least consideration, observation, and analysis of the types of experiences, developmental processes, and cultural resources that might be involved in their attainment. Explanations of such complex human behaviors in terms of innate inner competencies, however, make such empirical and analytic activities unnecessary, or to put it the other way around, foreclose such activities before they can begin. And I think this illustrates a move that Barbara makes quite often, and one that I'm very impressed with, find very helpful, which is to move from criticizing the particular argument she's engaging in, right? Say Atron's particular account, to criticizing the argument insofar as it exemplifies a certain style of argumentation, right? And here, the style being one that closes off questions that we might otherwise bring to this issue, and that we a group of people who would include potentially humanist scientists, humanists of various sorts, scientists of various sorts might bring to it. And in other words, forecloses what for Barbara seems to me to be a dialogue that should remain open, right, and should always remain. Okay, another example, the same style of thinking, I suppose, is her criticism of Dan Dennett, in his own study of naturalistic explanations of religion, breaking the spell, in particular for his total ignorance, right, of what informs belief, right? Barber takes Dennett to task not for his conclusions so much as for his extremely rigid understanding of the status of religious beliefs. More precisely, she rejects Dennett's suggestion that religious beliefs operate like scientific propositions and should thus give rise to empirical testing and procedures of verification. This, to Barber's mind, gets everything wrong before any analysis actually begins. Right? So, so Dennett's, considering the beliefs of contemporary religious people, and he basically says, they're in some sense dishonest, or they're not consequent in testing those beliefs, right, and submitting them to verification procedures. And according to Barber, this is foolish because it gets everything wrong. And I think not only is that a problem, and not only is that wrong, and so on, but it also exemplifies a way of thinking that stops questioning before it even starts. Right? So here's what she says. It seems clear from the terms of the contrast here between beliefs you can act on and just words, between things really done and confessing, that Dennett is unaware of what, in his terms, could be called the simplest relevant empirical facts. As documented by legions of scholars of religion, drawing on observations gathered across the globe, the overt or covert verbal professing of creedal propositions is rarely the center and certainly not the whole of religion for most believers, simple or sophisticated. On the contrary, people who identify themselves as religious, including educated people in apparently secularized societies, are likely to organize and conduct a good part of their lives around the substantive, bodily acting out of their religious identities in highly consequential, socially and emotionally risky, materially costly ways. Precisely, one could say, where the rubber meets the road. Here, citing Dennett's own terms for why science is better, right, in its own argument. Moreover, as emphasized by naturalists, both old and new, even those religious activities that may appear most like mere professing, such as participating in liturgical services, have crucial emotional and social effects upon, or it might be seen, perform crucial functions for participants and their communities. Given Dennett's strictly above-the-neck, disembodied conception of belief, he has no way of registering these activities, effects, or functions, much less understanding the complex multi-level forces that shape and sustain them, right? So the criticism here of the style of thinking is even more forceful because ultimately it says it's bad science, right? It's bad philosophy not to take account of the empirical facts, in this case, the robust context in which belief has meaning, and its differences, perhaps, in some ways, from science, although Barber's also everywhere engaged in showing how science works this way too, with kind of complex context that needs to be taken into account. So for me, these passages speak to the vexed question, as I said earlier, posed in its most constrictive and entrapping way by the Sokol affair, right, which now seems like ancient history, but I remember when I was very engaged with this, of whether a humanist or any other non-scientist has the right to engage with science in any mode other than adoration or total acquiescence. For Barbara, as for many of us, Latour, Stengers, Weinberger, Ludwig Fleck, right, who's very important to her, Kate Hales, Tim Lenoir, other people who we've also learned from here, science is much more than simply scientific procedures and results. But what Barbara does perhaps better than anyone else is to set apart the potentially very constraining dogmatic positions of scientists from the broader, more existential reverberations of scientific research, which cannot simply be dismissed as extra-scientific. More bluntly put, Barbara safeguards the continued capacity for all of us to have debates about scientific questions against the tendencies of some, perhaps many, scientists to seek closure, to give answers, and to end debate. Right? So here I am, speaking of the, and I guess before I got to know Barbara, I thought of her as a kind of critical thinker in the sense of Socrates, right, who is interested in demonstrating the limits of certain knowledge claims and the inherent limits of certain knowledge claims. And here I suppose I start to see the emergence of a kind of positive mode in her thinking, where she moves from the mode of negative critique to some form of taking sides, but taking sides again without without siding with any particular argument, right? But siding with way of posing the question, right? And that way of posing the question is always the way, or a way that leaves the question open or that opens to future debate about the question, right? And on this front, I see her as meeting the challenge that was proffered by John Guillory in the aftermath of the Sokol affair when he wrote an essay in Critical Inquiry that must be almost 10 years old now, that humanists, that basically with the entire adventure of post-structuralism and so on, to which I'm very attached in many ways, although I think Hillary makes an interesting point here, that humanists have basically, when we claim that we're exposing the impossibility of knowledge or blah, 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 this obviously gets taken in the press, or in the popular sphere in ways that we certainly wouldn't intend it, we're basically ceding the terrain of scientific knowledge claims to scientists. And Guillory's call there was for us to think about what we're doing as producing knowledge, right, as making certain kinds of knowledge claims that we may in fact have a certain expertise in making that are on a even par in some senses with the knowledge claims advanced by scientists. And it seems to me that this is just what Barbara's doing, right? This is just the space that Barbara's carving out for humanists who are engaged, not simply commenting on the research of science, but engaged in thinking through how science works. And as I said earlier, it's given me a certain kind of confidence as I remember when I was writing about neuroscience in relation to Viola, and at certain points it's like I want to make sure that I'm not actually advancing science claims or claims about science, or even earlier when I was talking about complexity theory in relation to Deleuze and Guattari, at a certain point I was very wondering what the status of my own discourse was when I was actually saying these people are right and these people are wrong. And in a certain way, it's no longer a problem. And I think that has something to do with the kind of work that Barbara is engaged in doing in showing the necessity of that kind of thing. My third point, what I learned from Barbara, is how her critique of epistemic imperatives is a quote now, to interpret human behavior with scientific understandings of other natural phenomena are limited, right? Or in plain language, her criticism of naturalization, right? We've already heard a little bit about E.O. Wilson and this idea that everything happens in a single plane or at a single level, the notion of a unified theory for everything. And this was particularly relevant and salient in the context of our workshop, where we were dealing constantly with questions of the naturalization of phenomenology, arguments that phenomenal experience, qualitative experience, which may or may not have anything to do with, in the imaginings of these philosophers and scientists, with phenomenological experience, was a kind of emergence out of a neural basis that, in fact, was the privileged ground. Right? So here's a quote from Disciplinary Cultures and Tribal Warfare essay in Science, Scandalous Knowledge. In view of the range of intellectual and institutional problems indicated above, certain remedies suggest themselves. One would be broad attention to the design and teaching of two culture-crossing courses that took seriously the interests of many students in the natural sciences and respected those students' general intellectual abilities and specific skills and knowledge. Another would be the creation of interdisciplinary research centers where natural scientists, social scientists, and humanists had multiple diverse occasions to interact intellectually over extended periods of time. Such projects, I think, are all to the good and where pursued show, in my experience, encouraging degrees of success. I would like to conclude, however, with a few words on an ostensibly remedial project that has a strong following in some quarters of the Academy that is, I think, distinctly not to the I refer to the idea currently made popular by E.O. Wilson's book, Consilience, that we should solve the problems of disciplinary difference by closing the gap between natural sciences and other fields of study, so that all knowledge would be, in fact, what it should be. So that all knowledge would be, in fact, what it should be, and is clearly destined to become, namely, unified. This is, I think, all pretty dubious. Okay, so I got a sort of first-hand acquaintance with the kind of broad meaning of this kind of an argument on Barbara's part in our workshop, as I was just saying, and I was at the time, I don't want to talk too much about my own work, but Barbara, this will say something to Barbara. I'm interested in thinking about the resources of phenomenology to address experience at microtemporal levels, to address sensory experience that isn't funneled through perception and consciousness. And so I'm very attracted by the naturalizing phenomenology approach, which gives a causal account, really, of the relationship between the phenomenological level and the neural level. And again, we had some philosophers present, and we had very interesting discussions, very generous people who were contributing to these discussions, but at certain moments when the neural correlative consciousness stuff emerged, that's when the room divides into two camps, right? And Barbara's hackles came out, and these were very interesting moments for me, because it wasn't so much that Barbara was arguing that, say, a particular version of this argument is wrong, right? What Barbara was arguing again was that this way of thinking shuts down the interesting questions and shuts down questioning, right? Because it says, here's the answer. One day, I mean, it's always in this kind of future mode too. We're going to one day be able to do these one-to-one correspondences between kinds of experiences, and always experiences in the very robust, very unrobust context of a laboratory where you're looking at one color or something like this, where you're going to be able to say, that's what consciousness is, right? And so it was really the style of thinking. This really, I think, got me thinking, without me even really knowing it, about that approach, and the approach that I had invested so much on. And I guess I now, because I thought at that time what I needed to do was follow people like Varela and like Thompson and give some kind of account, and they were looking at developmental systems theory and so on as a way of thinking about the emergence of consciousness from this level, that I had to give some answer to this, and now I don't think I do. Right now I think that these are two different levels that we can address in some ways as separate levels, right? As levels that may be continuous with one another, but we don't have to say one is more primary over the other, right? And it's something I've learned not from Barbara's critique of these particular arguments, but from her style of engaging with the entire problem. All right, two more. Do I have time for two more? 5 or 10 more minutes? Okay. Two more lessons from Barbara. And these are starting to get a little more general, but in some ways also more interesting to me. The fourth one is the embrace of complexity, her embrace of complexity in every instance, and her effort to take on, adopt a kind of universal perspective on the role of the environment, right? So problem is always, it might be neural correlates, or it might be some evolutionary psychological thing, religion or whatever. But ultimately, the question is, how do we relate to our environment? How are we implicated in our environment? In our environment in all of its great complexity. So there's a kind of imperative, and I'd say it's a kind of ethical imperative, and I've mentioned it many times before already, on Barbara's part, to keep questions open and to think about process rather than results, fixing of processes, and so on. And I find this, again, just inspiring, and it's inspiring in a particular way for me right now that I'll talk about in a minute, but I find it inspiring in general as a kind of way of occupying this position that she, in some ways, uniquely occupies as a person that makes more interesting our engagements as humanists with scientists. So this is a quote from the essay in Scandalous Knowledge called Supernatural Science. Again, addressing in its proximate way evolutionary psychology, but again, speaking more to a kind of style of thinking. So here's what Barbara has to say. Contrary to those accounts given by Pinker, Wilson, and Tooby and Cosmides, and rehearsed by their followers, the issues that divide evolutionary psychology from its major critics are not whether biology in general or evolutionary theory in particular is relevant to the study of human behavior, or whether some, perhaps many, endemic traits or tendencies could be naturally selected adaptations. Both of these claims, where properly stated and understood, are commonly granted. The issues are rather whether the particular explanations offered by evolutionary psychology are intellectually cogent and can properly lay exclusive claim to due scientificity in the study of human behavior and cognition, and no less significantly, whether such explanations trump the understandings of the human scene, interior and exterior, developed by myriad other social scientists, ethnographers, psychologists, sociologists, and so forth, over the past century, and by myriad chroniclers, historians, biographers, diarists, diplomats, journalists, travelers, essayists, poets, novelists, playwrights, and so forth, over the past 2 millennia. To dismiss all this as the theoretically benighted record of superficial phenomena for the worthless impressions of amateurs is not to create a rigorous science of human behavior. It is to operate myopically in an impoverished universe. And I'm very struck by the final sentence, right? To operate myopically in an impoverished universe, right? So in a certain sense, I would say what Barbara's trying to do in the kind of generosity with which she comments on pink, another word for the first thing I mentioned, generosity, right? Is to make the universe more interesting, right? To make it less myopic and less impoverished than these people do. So my final lesson I've learned from Barbara is a kind of, again, it's something where I've developed the confidence to think something I want to think, and it is the role of common sense. And in my own intellectual formation, common sense was identified with humanist formations, with limited knowledge. I mean, it was the argument of Foucault and Deleuze, say, where, in a kind of critique of phenomenology that I now think is wrong, where, the different senses converge on the same world, right? And, what Foucault and Deleuze want to say is, well, each of these senses has a different world, and there's non-overlap and so on, and it's more interesting for that reason, and I think that's what's in phenomenology. But at any rate, there was a kind of way in which common sense was disparaged, right? Common sense was not something that we could really think through in a positive way. And reading Barbara and thinking with Barbara has helped me to reevaluate the role of common sense and to see that particular debate, which had been sort of holding me up in some ways, as a very particular kind of a thing in a more general terrain. And so I guess, I mean, I'm really interested in, I've been working a lot on Whitehead recently, and Whitehead as a kind of, in relation to some of the questions in phenomenology that I'm dealing with. And Whitehead is somebody who, as some of you may know, is interested in, in the most complex way imaginable, explaining the simplest thing imaginable, namely concreteness of our experience, right, or the concreteness of experience. And he resorts to a kind of version of common sense that has the particular character of asserting a kind of continuum across all the different scales of experience, from the formation of actual entities, which are the real things, the only real things there are in the universe, but which we have no experiential access to, we have only speculative access to, all the way up to, the most, in some ways, the pinnacle of human, or the pinnacle of nature, which is human consciousness, but also the most limited mode of knowledge and experience of them all. So common sense involves taking the situation, taking stock of the reality of the situation, or taking stock of those facts that Barbara is accusing Dennett of not being able to deal with, or having no clue about. So again, I have a passage. It's from the introduction, Scandals of Knowledge chapter in Scandalous Knowledge, where she says, as distinct from rationalist conceptualizations, knowledge, everyday expert scientific, may be understood not in opposition to mere belief, but as beliefs that have become relatively established. So understood, knowledge, beliefs can be seen as emerging continuously from three interacting sets of forces: individual perceptual behavioral activities and experiences, general cognitive processes, and in particular, social collective systems of thought and practice. Accordingly, the familiar contrast between duly compelled by reason and improperly influenced by interests and or emotions gives way to the idea that all beliefs are contingently shaped and multiply constrained. Similarly, such familiar distinction as those between objectively valid scientific knowledge and personal opinion or popular superstition are replaced by the idea that all beliefs are more or less congruent with and connectable to other relatively stable and well-established beliefs, more or less effective with regard to solving current problems and or furthering ongoing projects, more or less appropriable by other people and extendable to further domains of application. That is, differences expressed by the classic contrasts, and there certainly are differences, and they are certainly important, are not denied or flattened out. Reason is not abandoned for irrationalism. Scientific knowledge is not equated with myth or ideology, and so on. But they are reconceived as variable gradients rather than fixed, distinct, and polar opposites. And in a certain sense, I think the emphasis here is on the genesis of beliefs, right? And the notion that you see in various aspects of Barbara's work, that there isn't a hard and fast distinction between a scientific proposition and a belief, a truth and a belief, but that beliefs are really what all of this is about, and that there isn't a hard and fast distinction, just as there is with language, between poetic and everyday language, between everyday and scientific, or everyday and expert beliefs. There's a kind of continuum, and the important thing is to analyze the very, very complex process of genesis of beliefs, and that's what Barbara does, and that's really what I'm seeing as a kind of a commitment to the concrete and a kind of new ground upon which to think about the real value of common sense, of this common sense in this sense, for kind of work, at least that I'm engaged on. So I want to now have a couple of concluding thoughts, where I return to this question of, why was it that Barbara seemed to like my work or be happy that I was coming to something like this? And I now see, I suppose, right, and why wasn't it like I got here and then she took me down, she takes down all these people, right? So I see there's a kind of affinity between my own work and her work. And it's an affinity, I mean, even though I guess I would say that I can't help but sort of turn everything into a theoretical claim in the strong sense and so forth. But I'm trying now, at least, to do that by embracing the biggest kind of context that I can. And I see a real sort of, there's a kind of shared commitment to the complexity of situations. And I'll just mention maybe one example, which is one thing I like about Whitehead is his idea that, he talks about this thing called prehensions, which are sort of the basic relationalities that happen in the world that are what compose everything, including our bodies as societies of actual entities and so on. And it doesn't even matter the details of this. But what Whitehead says is that every single actual entity prehends the entirety of the universe, right? And it can do so positively by having a contentful relationship, or negatively by excluding parts of the universe, but that exclusion itself is a relationship, right? And I find this just an incredibly, one of the implications of this is that there is no virtual that's outside of the actual, but in fact potentiality and virtuality are built into, potentiality and virtuality are built into the actual. I mean, it's an exciting idea. But it's a crazy thought in some ways, right? That everything, no matter what scale you're talking about it, involves a relationship with the entirety of everything in the universe at that time, right? It's a crazy idea, but it's an idea that I'm really into, and I think I'm more able, this is the last thing I want to say really, I'm more able to entertain it because of having, developed my thinking about it in proximity with Barbara in these workshops, and also in some kind of relationship with, with her commitment to this deep context and her taking of arguments, no matter how crazy they may seem, seriously. So I'll end right there.
Thanks so much, Mark. It's on now. We do have, let's see, probably about 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes for questions and conversation from the floor. So, floor is open. Tim.
Yeah, I have one comment that's somewhat facetious maybe, but goes in a slightly different direction from the appreciation that Mark has for the ways in which Barbara is open to all possibilities. And I just want to say, don't you really think, I mean, you gave the most generous quotation there, but don't you really think that in Scandalous Knowledge, or I think it's in Scandalous Knowledge, that Barbara really gives Steven Pinker a beat down?
Yes. I mean, it seems to me that Barbara's mellowed from Scandalous Knowledge to the Natural Reflections volume on that issue, right? But I mean, certainly it's necessary to give Pinker that kind of feedback. Yes. So.
I have a question for Liz about Mark's understanding of Barbara's position. You were emphasizing the importance of incommensurability between psychoanalysis and neurological findings. Mark is sort of emphasizing Barbara's ability to look for full contexts and so forth. Can you comment in relation to that about your argument about the importance of incommensurability?
This is on? Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's something to do with the difference between when we're talking about someone like Pinker, who's deep in science wars, the culture wars, whatever we want to call it, and a literature that takes itself to have solved that in a different kind of way from the way that Pinker thinks he's solving it. So Pinker thinks he's solving it. It's been a long time since I've read it, but he thinks he's solving it by simply obliterating large parts of the world. This neuropsychoanalysis project is extremely kind of hungry and integrative in its orientations. It's taking everything in. And it seems to be generating a monoculture biological root from the monoculture that, say, Pinker wants to generate. And something about the Pinker-esque monoculture that, in fact, calls forth the generosity of what Mark's just spoken to, I think. And one of the best ways to address it, I think, is through its deep contextualization. These other monocultures that are very, very integrative, very conciliant in their orientations, seem to require something to disrupt. Something needs to get in there and just say these things don't line up the way that we think they do. And so there seems to be, in my brain, there seems to be different kinds of drives to things lining up. Pinker versus what's going on in psychoanalysis.
I suppose I wanted to say something about, one of the big problems in dealing with Whitehead for me is, what do you do with this speculative, that there's an argument that the things that really are in the universe, actual entities, are things we cannot ever experience, and we can only know them speculatively. So there's a kind of real return of ontology and speculative. And so in some sense, there's a fundamental incompatibility at the very foundation of everything there. But it's one that doesn't stifle creativity in his terms. And it seems to me that what he gives us is ultimately then a kind of continuum where, somebody who wants to defend the value of consciousness as the highest achievement of nature and really say that this is the most important thing can coexist in a way where that person is right with someone who says, no, really what's going on is the neural events and so on and so forth. These are different perspectives on one and the same world, right? So there are decisions that are made about how to look at one and the same world ultimately. And so it seems to me, and that's not to say that the incompatibility between them at a certain level isn't important. It is, right? But it's to say that it isn't something that one side's right and the other side's wrong, or that has to be the way it comes out, right? That in fact, so it doesn't have to be something that shuts down debate. So I give that as a kind of, that would be a kind of analogy, I suppose, to how I see, because I don't see, this is where I was saying something about positive knowledge or something positive mode in Barbara's work. I don't see her only showing, when she investigates, for example, it's clearest maybe when she's investigating the positions of sort of liberal scholars on certain debates, and she takes them to task just as much as she takes someone like Pinker to task. And the point is, to me, the point is not simply to say this person is wrong, right? But it's to point out the narrowness of context in which this person makes the claim to be either right or wrong. They make the claim to be right, but in which we would evaluate if it's either right or wrong. So I think it's that she's taking things into a bigger context, into a bigger picture of the the non-impoverished universe, right, to put it in her terms there, in which these incompatibilities are not absolute incompatibilities or things that shut down debate. I mean, that's how I would look at it.
Yeah, so it seems to me
Want
that
to look at it.
there are incompatibilities or incompatibilities that are generative.
Yes.
Yeah, and the origin. Yeah, and that is what one is getting to, it's what a number of other people are getting to in a really exhilarating kind of way. So we
and again, it speaks also to the post-structuralist, the Guillory post-structuralist thing where the incompatibilities are not ends in themselves, but they become generative of something. Yes.
But I mean, I feel like I'm still kind of staggering around in the dark a little to get a handle on this neuropsychoanalysis literature because it's so large. I mean, so do you have thoughts in another direction?
I do, but I'll express them in my own talk a little bit later.
Isn't one of the problems that science can't go further because that would impose upon the results that they get? One of the problems in science is that they never report negative results. And if you add a larger context to the particularity of the problem, then they see that as imposing on the result and not as a proper result, so to speak. And it seems to me that in some ways you could say science, they shouldn't take that and make claims as this is the truth. I agree with that. But one of the problems is, of course, they seem to be limited in the scope that they can take in science. And that what leaves them with a sense of, well, this must be true because I have not allowed anything to impose upon myself, so therefore this must be true. I'm not really trying to defend science here, but you happen to know about these.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and it obviously is a very complicated question too because it involves, certainly younger scientists who are beginning their careers, cannot just say, well, I think science is too limited and I'm going to do it in a new framework where I embrace the complexity of the situation, right? I mean, this is true. But that said, there are scientists who, it's again a kind of spectrum, right? Where you have scientists like, let's say, like someone like Lynn Margulis, right? Who, makes an effort in her theorization of evolutionary processes, I suppose, one-celled organisms and symbiogenesis and so on to, really embrace a kind of a situation in its global perspective. And that said, there's still necessity to generate research, right? So I mean, I think it's an issue that is important, but it's one that can be dealt with in much more complex ways than simply saying because science has to generate results, that's how it has to happen.
But then is that not our job rather than the job of the scientist that we take the results of the scientist and then because we are allowed to see larger contexts without being confused with being scientists?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's now that we're increasingly working together with scientists, I mean, I think it's not our job. I mean, that used to be the way it was, and I think that was resented very much by scientists as well, right? And I'm not the expert here, you should hear from Barbara here. But I mean, I think now that we're working with scientists, and we find out in doing this, I mean, Rob and I have actually sat down with some practicing scientists because we're interested in actually finding a connection with neuroscience on attention and perception and so on, that's not simply at the level of neurocorrelate theory and how do we both feel about that and blah, 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 but actually is driven by the similar kinds of questions. Like, what does experience mean? What does it mean in this kind of context? And when you start doing that, then you find out, well, scientists aren't just, implementing procedures in some kind of abstract way, the way we think they are. They have questions, meaningful questions, or questions concerning meaning that are driving their research. And I think that things become much closer. There's a ground for sharing and collaboration and seeing continuities between what we do and what they do. We want to still put it in those terms. And so, I mean, I think that it's both of everybody's interest.
This is a question about literature. I could get that back into the conversation. It has to do with Jonathan's beautiful appropriation of Barbara's comment about some theory or some application, and some essay you wrote a long time ago. And I think it's very interesting that you returned her favor. In other words, she showed that it was precisely when you were violating your theory that you became interesting. And I think you returned the favor nicely and showed that she does very much the same thing, and I agree with that entirely. I'm just wondering whether or not there's a lesson or a generality that can be drawn from this, having to do with the relationship between literature and theory, and the fact that there's always some kind of a remainder that comments, that redounds on the theory and shows its shortcomings. And if this sort of dynamic you're pointing out in the literature-theory relationship doesn't sort of obtain in the science-philosophy relationship or conflict as well.
I think that the general point is doubtless true. There's always a remainder, and that will be of interest in relation to the theory, etc. I don't think it pertains to either of the two cases here. That Barbara's claim I cited, it was not that the shortcomings of my theory somehow illuminated literature. It was that I succeeded, doubtless because I was proceeding like a good new critic, that even though I had this weird framework with linguistics as the model, nevertheless I was able to solve some problems and talk about poems and novels because I was deviating from my theory and not slavishly following it. I don't think that the theory in her account certainly was not productive in some way through the failure, or through some certain kind of failure, pointing out something. Anyway, and certainly in her case, I was wanting to argue that there was this sort of extraneous premise, which is asserted quite vigorously in Poetic Closure and then developed at great length on the margins of discourse, which seems to be wrong, and which my argument was that she does very well without it, and indeed at moments where she has to try to take up a particular problem with the poems that she's talking about, that particular theory of imitation, the poem as an imitation speech act, is of no use whatsoever. It doesn't help to solve these problems, and that she rightly ignores it. So I do think those cases are different from the general.
But that's sort of my point.
What?
That there's a moment when you're called on to abandon whatever it was you thought you're fighting.
Yeah. Well, it's not so much the pressure of the literary work. There are certainly other cases one can imagine where the application of it you actually are. And I think in Barbara's case, she isn't really trying to apply. She's not trying to apply that imitation speech act theory to the work. She's not saying that could happen. That somebody goes along and starts talking about the work as here's there's this George Herbert imagines a speaker who is addressing the day, and then addressing the rose, and then addressing the spring, and etc. And then what's the context? He's walking around on a spring day and realizes sadly that all these things are going to die, and then suddenly, hey, there's something else that isn't going to die, and that's my sweet and virtuous soul. And he has that realization. You could make a little mini narrative out of this, and she could be doing that, and then notice that, hey, but this. I have to explain why this speaker, as he's strolling around, uses rhymes, and why is what's this? What kind of discourse is that? Is he making fun of his own discourse by making it into a somewhat sing-songy fashion? So there are certainly elements of the poem that wouldn't fit that model, and she could then have a realization that, hey, this is a poem and not a real everyday speech act. She doesn't follow that procedure, rightly so, and so that would be a case where the theory would break down and would come to a realization that. Poetic discourse needs something else other than the theory of an imitation speech act.
We have time for one more question before we take a break for lunch. Just one more. Stanley, have you jump in, and I'll make sure that we recognize you.
A very minor point in response to what Jonathan has just said. Virtue is almost the only poem of purpose that doesn't fit the model of the speech act utterance. Almost all of Herbert's poems are poems in which a speaker, the speaker, almost one might call the Herbertian speaker, is wondering how to come to terms with what Jesus Christ has done, finds it impossible to do so, or wondering about how to come to terms with his own finitude. Best example among many is the poem Forerunners, which I think of as the first Alzheimer's poem, in which the speaker looks in the mirror, sees some white hairs, and begins to realize that what is going to happen will not only take away his physical mobility, but the movements of his mind. And then for 3 or 4 stanzas, he pretends to come to terms with his insight and to relinquish what he is going to lose, but knows that he cannot. That is, he cannot successfully perform this act of renunciation. So wearily at the end, he finally does, or at least gives the impression of doing by saying, "Go, birds of spring." That is, that's the movement. Go, take it back, birds of spring. And then the last 2 lines, which also illustrate closure in a way that I think is extraordinary and corresponds to Proverbs models. And every time I either hear or read or think about these lines, I'm just struck so by their whole power. The voice says, "Let a bleak paleness chalk the door, so all within be livelier than before." That's it. That's why we're all here in this business.
Well, Sam said it's certainly true, not that he's overstated the case, but there are lots of superb poems that do where it is useful to imagine a speaker, and that imagining a speaker in a dramatic situation illuminates the poem. I think also quite a few others that don't. Prayer is one obviously comes to mind, where I don't think the imagining the circumstance in which the speaker in a circumstance in which he's producing all these metaphorical equivalences for prayer, and then ends with something understood. It's not a dramatic monologue. But anyway, but your general point is right. And I'm certainly not saying that there are no poems that fit the model of dramatic monologue. It's a very productive model, but it's not for very large numbers of poems. It is not.
Thanks to all, to Jonathan, Elizabeth, and Mark for these talks.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.